Welcome to our neuro-linguistic programming training, but I want to start by talking a little about NLP. Why scientific NLP? Where does this idea of NLP come from? What is NLP programming? Neuro-linguistic programming? Well, NLP, in fact, the so-called neuro-linguistic programming will emerge in the 70s with two different guys, Richard Bandler and Frank Pucelik. It's not John Grinder, it's not John Grinder. It is not John Grinder. Richard Bandler was working with the transcripts of Fritz Perls, and Frank Pucelik was working in the field of recovery and rehabilitation of young people with drug problems, providing support, assistance, and guidance. Young people who had drug problems, and then our explanation of neuro-linguistic programming will be great because they will understand how they arrived in Virginia, Satir and all those people who became famous. That's it. It is not written in the books of NLP. What happened? Richard Bandler was from the exact sciences. He was a computer guy at the University of California, and he was very interested in psychology. However, at the University of California at that time, there was no course in Gestalt therapy, and Gestalt therapy was starting to gain popularity among therapists. They were much more focused on the time in psychoanalysis, a little bit of psychoanalysis, a little bit of behaviorism, and Richard Bandler, he was working with material from Fritz Perls. In fact, he was a friend of Robert Spitzer, the owner of the publishing house that was going to publish Fritz Perls' book. So Bandler was with the notes from the seminars and transcribing them to turn into a book, and he wanted to take a course in Gestalt therapy. But that course did not exist, no. He was at the university. Bandler became friends with Frank Pucelik, who was a Vietnam War veteran. And he was helping young people who had problems with drugs, and that's how they met. At that time in college, if you could get authorization from some professor, you could start creating extension courses and study groups. Then Richard Bandler, who was a student of John Grinder, achieved this with John Grinder, who was a professor at the college. It's funny because John Grinder is much older than Richard Bandler. If you look at photo of the two, it seems that John Grinder is younger than Richard Bandler due to the excesses of Richard Bandler's worldly life. So John Grinder was a coordinator of the study group. He wasn't a coordinator. He was the guy who signed to establish the Gestalt therapy extension course. And they started to take this Gestalt therapy course there, conducted by Richard Bandler and Frank Pucelik, who was helping. John Grinder did not yet have a connection with the group. He was just the guy who authorized the course. And from there, a study group called the Meta Group emerged. Why was it called Meta? In this group, John Grinder and Frank Pucelik were interested in understanding something that today in psychology we are seeking to understand in what is called process-based therapy. Has anyone heard of process-based therapy? It is about understanding the principles that underlie all therapeutic practices. They function instead of worrying about behaviorism with psychoanalysis. Why the emotional expression of, can psychoanalysis work? Why can going back in time work? Why this dialectical exchange? Can it work? Why can speaking in self-help groups be beneficial? In other words, therapy-based, they aim to discover this. It guided neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, initially, and then the idea was as follows. Wait a minute. I want to discover this using something called modeling. They will translate it as shaping. I don't like the term shaping because it is already used in psychology for other things. In psychology, shaping is learning through successive approximations. That is, if I want to teach a dog to dance, I will reward him when he stands up. After he stands up, I will only reward when he takes a different turn after standing up. These are approximations, successive steps until the desired behavior emerges. This in psychology in English is called modeling, and in English it is shaping, which means to give form. However, what they use here is modeling, which is modeling, or shaping, which is taking from a model. By the way, I think that the most commonly used term in Portuguese is not modelamento, but modelação. Anyway, they will start to emerge. The assumptions of NLP here are, if anyone can do it, then anyone can do it. At the time, the name NLP didn't even exist. It was still the Meta Group. It was called Meta because Meta means above. They wanted to know which techniques were above any therapeutic technique. Like Richard Bandler was already working with the materials of Fritz Perls. They created a group that was for Gestalt therapy. In other words, initially the target group was a Gestalt therapy group, and they started to want to know the following. Okay, but I want to understand better what is behind it. The functioning of Gestalt therapy. And then something interesting happened. Richard Bandler and Frank Pucelik was achieving results in the clinic using Gestalt therapy that were better than the others. Students from the study group. There were other students in the study group, namely Richard Bandler and Frank Pucelik, internalized some behaviors that they did not know what they were, which were unconscious and were having more success than the other students. Then they called John Grinder. Let's understand what the structure is. What about magic? What is the structure behind magic? And then there were the three of them, John Grinder, the Richard Bandler, and Frank Pucelik. So what happened? After they learned some elements of Fritz Perls involved emotional expression, the technique of forgiveness in the chair, including techniques that neuro-linguistic programming itself uses. He no longer uses it. Remember, I mentioned that Robert Spitzer, the owner of Science and Behavior Books, was a friend of Richard Bandler, who hired him. Did Richard Bandler do the transcripts of Fritz Perls? This publisher was responsible for the publication of all the books by Virginia Satir. He said, man, since you are trying to understand the magic behind the therapists, why don't you and John Grinder go there? Virginia Satir, and do you see what she is doing? And then they started to model, that is to learn of the model Virginia Satir. And then they discovered various patterns of Virginia Satir, and this pattern, it was named the meta model. Later, we will work with the meta model, which involves questioning Socratic. The interesting thing is that the meta model arises from the conception that change will arise from the end of distorted thinking. The more specific I am when questioning, the less there will be cognitive distortion. They did not use cognitive distortion, but called it distortion of thought. For example, the person would say, nobody loves me. There is a generalization here. Then you ask, are you sure that no one? Is there really no one in the whole world who loves you? Or the people who are close to you, did they tell you that they don't love you? Notice that it was taking something that was a generalization of a belief and they wanted to specify that. And they fought against this with questions that were what? Specific. And then they did all of this regarding those specific questions with Virginia Satir. And then the concern arose with the use of elements that we will work on here, such as sensory channels, modalities, submodalities, and metamodel. However, in the study group, there was an illustrious guy. This little study group had Stephen Gilligan, who is one of the fathers of New Ericksonian hypnosis. Robert Dilts was in this study group. Gregory Bateson was in this group of studies. Gregory Bateson was among the top anthropologists of the 20th century. He was not it's like a study group from school, where you gather two classmates who haven't read the book. Got it. They were researchers. And then Gregory Bateson, who was John Grinder's neighbor, said, you are very concerned about these specific questions. Your techniques are very incomplete. They were passionate about the meta model, but it was very incomplete because there is a guy there in Phoenix, in Arizona, which instead of being specific is generalist. It tells stories that never end. And during a conversation, people enter a hypnotic trance. This is a technique of Milton Erickson. At the time, Gregory Bateson wanted John Grinder to go there. In fact, the videos you find on the internet of Milton Erickson, almost everyone was filmed by Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson, he was a cameraman for Milton Erickson. And then John Grinder did not want to go to Milton Erickson at all. None. Because Milton Erickson had released several books, the collection of books by Milton Erickson is enormous, and John Grinder was the straight-laced one of the duo. He said, I am not going to approach a guy like that, famous and so relevant, with so many books published without having read all the books. Richard Bandler said, you will, on the way to, people pick up a book and take a quick look. If we wait, we will never go there. Richard Bandler has always been the most of action, and John Grinder has always been the more academic one, which is why the duo worked well together. They were just like that. They went without having read any books. They arrived there, knew nothing about hypnosis, and started to observe Milton Erickson at work. And then they published the book, 2 volumes actually, the patterns, hypnotic patterns of Milton Erickson. They were patterns that Milton Erickson used for communication and that the Erickson did not realize. What we understand as NLP will become neuro-linguistic programming due to some conflict that there was a meeting between Pucelik and Richard Bandler. In fact, Frank Pucelik did not go to Milton Erickson's house. He was cut off earlier, and Richard Bandler had a lot of influence with John Grinder. John Grinder was the strong arm, the strong link of the business. Then they expelled Frank Pucelik and invented the name programming, neurolinguistics. The term NLP originated. And from the 1970s onwards, books emerged with this idea of neurolinguistic programming. This is the story of NLP. That is, it begins with a group of studies of people who were motivated to discover how to do therapy differently. And one fantastic thing I see from this study group is that when we had the shaman, people had a lot of magic. When we had a mesmerist, a magnetist, a healer, look at how much the change that we experience because of this, because we believe that something fantastic will happen. And at the moment that medicine emerged as we have it today, I think it's great. You know, I am not against medicine. But a large part of the magic comes from the moment you understand the mechanism. The action behind everything, the expectation that something fantastic will happen is diminishing, and then the magic starts to fade. The same thing happened in psychology. At the moment when the priest, the pastor, the healer, they turned, the psychologist had a loss there. So, of course, I would never say that we did not have gains. Of course, there are gains with a scientific practice. I am saying to go to the shaman or to go to the shaman, right? And I am not going to control my health with the shaman. No, I am not going to do the same. Our friend Guilherme does this thing, injecting frog venom into the body, named Cambo. That's what it's called, right? No, I'm not into those things. But there is a loss of magic there. There is a loss. Today, what happens is that she is talking about it here. It is about how today we have a lot of mixing of the mystical with hypnosis and with neuro-linguistic programming. Without a doubt, surely this mixture displeases me. Why does it displease me? But why does it displease me? I am not against the mystical when it proposes to be mystical. For example, I love the healer. I have nothing against it. I have already taken a course on magnetism and spiritism. If you are in a religious context, seek counseling. Pastoral, the problem is that you take these spiritualist mystical elements. You can use the term that you want and bring it into a practice scientifically. The client who arrives no longer knows, but what is science and what is not? This causes confusion, and this applies to hypnosis. Hypnosis will reprogram your cell. No, man, there is no evidence that hypnosis will do that. Already, there is evidence of the placebo effect. That's another thing. It's not exactly what these people have here. Now, at the same time, why is this mixture emerging? Because people need magic. I am talking about needing magic in a non-pejorative sense of the term. People, they need that expectation that something incredible can happen today, and it doesn't even have to be esoteric, to have that feeling that something amazing is going to happen today. No, sometimes, for example, we have this with a psychiatrist. The person has already had a terrible experience with several psychiatrists out there, but there was one that you connected with that changed the medication. Man, now everything is going to be different. This makes what is missing for human beings is this idea that something incredible is going to happen. Then how does science, becoming increasingly bland in terms of practice, because psychology, people, is very different from medicine. My patient wants something magical. He wants something magical. He wants something different. He wants something. Look, I even support the idea of a person having multiple occupations. For example, a guy can be a hypnotist, being a dancer and a spiritual leader on the weekend. I don't see a problem with a person having multiple roles. The problem arises when the performances mix during clinical practice. And this has been happening. And I think the problem with this is that it generates a lot of intellectual dishonesty. Because the person, she uses her belief, which often isn't the belief of the other person, right? This ends up invading the other person's space. So why is this emerging now? In psychology, when we start to have a more scientific practice, it is clear that our proposal has a scientific practice, but we are removing the magic. It's natural for the magic to fade away. The placebo effect is much less magical than animal magnetism. I understand. The increase in immunity through suggestion is less magical than me saying that I will reprogram it. Reprogramming the cell aligns more with the expectation that something magical will happen. And so in a way, neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, will rescue the magic, just as hypnosis rescues the magic. Even if you work with an evidence-based hypnosis practice, at the moment you arrive in the clinic, it says, let's do hypnosis. Nothing will be the same as before. Hypnosis will happen. And this is one thing I like about neuro-linguistic programming is that although it sometimes exaggerates a lot, including for reasons that I imagine it is market-driven. Richard Bandler talks negatively about psychology all the time, as if the Gestalt therapy would not have come from psychology. So, speak poorly, say that psychology is delayed. Who has heard this talk? Psychology is outdated. In neuro-linguistic programming, we cure phobias in 5 minutes. Then the term neuro-linguistic programming emerged, which is called NLP, and it is a term that I consider to be incorrect. I will explain why I consider the term neuro-linguistic programming to be incorrect. In Portuguese, it is NLP. In English, it's NLP. But when the term neuro-linguistic programming emerged, I think it was intentional. When you watch Richard Bandler's interviews, he has a pretty cool story that is obviously made up. But it's a cool story. I have a saying that goes, we should never interrupt a good story with the truth. Anyway, the story of Richard Bandler is as follows. He was in the car. For those who know the story, he was in the car driving, and he was from computer science and had some programming books of computer and linguistics inside the car. Then the officer stopped him and asked for the documentation. He showed, what do you do? I am a teacher. Teacher of what? Then supposedly Bandler would have looked at, behind the car like that, I saw those books. I saw the books on programming. I saw the books on linguistics. I am a professor of neuro-linguistic programming. The story is cool. It's made up, for heaven's sake. God, right? But anyway, this is the story that Richard Bandler tells. Now, I will share my version. What happens? The field of neuro-linguistics already existed. Neuro-linguistics is a special field of linguistics that will study language acquisition, speech disorders, and their relationship with the brain. Perhaps you have already heard about, for example, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, areas of the brain related to language. When a person has certain types of aphasia, which are these, language disorders, for example, when there is a problem in Broca's area, she keeps repeating the same word all the time. There was a guy who became famous whose name was Tan. He would say tan, 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 but did he speak with the expression of tan, tan, like tan, tan, tan? In other words, did he say tan, tan like a intention? And people who had Wernicke's aphasia, they spoke fluently, but with random words. Kangaroo, around, camera, then air conditioning, and they spoke things that were completely nonsensical in a fluent manner. It was then discovered in the field of neurolinguistics, the brain damage related to language. That is, the field of neurolinguistics already existed and has nothing to do with this. It already existed. The field of neurolinguistics. The name gives the impression it is scientific, but it is not. It's that there is another extra element here, which is NLP. In English, NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming, abbreviation for something that is natural language processing. What is natural language processing? It is a study of artificial intelligence and how I can create an interaction between humans and machines, naturally human form. Alexa, for example. Now, one interesting thing is we have this thing huge today with natural language processing with Alexa, but the term is not new. The term is very old. Richard Bandler was into programming, but this thing was already booming in the 1970s. Post-war. He will say that he did not know that NLP was a term from natural language communication processing. I don't believe it. I think he took an acronym that already existed in computing, a term that already existed in linguistics, to give an academic status to something that was no longer academic, because the metagroup started as academic, but it ceased to be academic and he wanted to give it that air. The point is that I think he wanted to emphasize that this thing is academic. I think so, I do. I wanted to bring more evidence for neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. Richard Bandler does something. Everyone says that science is not needed, but they are constantly using terms that refer to science like the own neuro-linguistics. Now, the official explanation of the term that I will give now is that in neuro-linguistic programming, programming would have to do with the structure and altering the structure that the people have behind neurobehavior, the understanding that this will be mediated by a brain, and linguistics relates to the way this will happen. That is, it would be the reprogramming of language through the understanding of how the brain works. This is the official explanation that you will find. So, regarding the term neuro-linguistic programming. Now, Richard Bandler is going to talk about programming. Neuro-linguistics is everything that works. They start to use things from Milton Erickson. This is curious. There is a communication pattern from Milton Erickson called non-specific verb. It is used to confuse people. For example, there is a calamity. Actions will be taken. And then, all right, actions will be taken. There's something involving corruption. We will sort this out. Corrupt ones. They will not pass. We will solve this. What are we going to solve? The we are going to solve is actually a term that is used in a non-specific way. Do you want one that both boyfriend and girlfriend use? No. I'm saying that no one here in the room uses it. You have never used it. I'm going to change. Actually, what happens is that we have multiple meanings. When we have multiple meanings, you paralyze the other. It says like this: I will solve this. And then I use the meta model. Specifically, it will be solved by doing what, right? So at the moment you say like this, NLP is using what works. What does that mean, man? Richard Bandler says this: NLP is about using what works. And I really like the techniques of NLP because some reasons. First, because they are techniques that are essentially playful. Every technique of NLP, except for sleight of mouth and the meta model, which are techniques for powerful questioning and inquiries. Criteria: the NLP techniques are very imaginative. You are at the cinema and there, on the cinema screen, something playful happens that brings back the idea that something cool is going to happen. Dude, it's not something normal. It's not a normal therapy session where I'm just talking about my life. Something fantastic is going to happen. And we will be able to use these techniques with ourselves here to understand more about it. These techniques with us. And then the first element that was studied in the meta group, including Robert Dilts, is the genius of NLP in my view. And Robert Dilts was in that study group. He was in one of the classes in the Sleight of Mouth course, which is by Robert Dilts. He mentions that the first One thing that the meta group started to develop was the meta model. And in the meta model, things were getting intense. When we talk the meta model, you will understand why things break down. Meta model is a manual on how to argue with a colleague. That's basically it. It is very good for therapy, but it can be the manual for fighting with each other. And then what happened? They started to have fights involving the students. It was there that NLP began to focus on rapport, on how to connect with others, why connect with the other. And it is interesting that from that moment on, in all neuro-linguistic programming training, the first thing that what exists to be said is about rapport. And because of that, we are going to talk today about rapport, how to connect with another, what neuroscience knows about rapport, how to connect with the other, in short. And so we are going to talk about the myth of charisma, and we will discuss humanistic psychology,